There is a particular kind of tired that no amount of sleep can reach. It lives somewhere behind the eyes, settles into the shoulders, and makes even the smallest movements feel like they cost something. I was sitting on the edge of my daughter Lily's bed that night, in the soft amber glow of her little bedside lamp, feeling every ounce of that tiredness. It had been a long day, the kind that started before the sun, and never really let me catch my breath. There was the morning rush, the spilled cereal, the missing shoe that turned out to be under the couch, the long drive to drop her at school before sprinting to a job that had been squeezing me thinner every single week. Then the pickup, the dinner I scraped together from whatever was left in the fridge, the bath, the brushing of teeth, the endless, gentle negotiations that come with putting a 6-year-old to bed. And now here I was, finally, in the quiet, thinking I had made it through one more day. Lily was already in her pajamas, the pale blue ones with the little clouds on them, her hair still slightly damp from the bath, and she was looking at me the way she sometimes did, with a softness that felt older than her years. I told her it was time to sleep, that I loved her. To the moon and back, the same words I said every night, the little ritual that held our small world together. But instead of lying down, she sat up and reached her small hands toward me, and she touched my face. Her fingers were warm and impossibly gentle, tracing the lines around my eyes, the rough stubble on my jaw, the tiredness she could somehow feel, even if she couldn't name it. I tried to smile, the automatic smile, the one I'd perfected over the past 2 years since her mother left, the smile that said everything was handled and everyone was safe. But Lily didn't smile back. She just kept looking at me, her little brow furrowing the way it did when she was trying very hard to understand something too big for her hands to hold. I felt my throat tighten. There's something about being seen by your own child, truly seen, that strips away every wall you've spent the day building. I had told so many people I was fine that day. The teacher who asked how we were managing, the neighbor who waved over the fence, the cashier who made small talk, while I counted out coins more carefully than I wanted her to see. Fine, fine, fine. The word had become a reflex, a shield, a small, flat lie. I told to keep the world moving, but Lily wasn't the world. She was the whole reason I kept the world moving at all. And in that warm lamplit room, with her tiny hands still resting against my cheek, I felt the weight of everything I had been carrying, alone pressed down on me at once. The bills I hadn't told anyone about, the phone calls I didn't return, the nights I lay awake doing math that never added up, the ache of being both mother and father and never feeling like I was quite enough of either. I leaned into her touch without meaning to, just for a second, just long enough to feel how much I needed it. And she felt me lean. Of course she did. Children feel everything, even the things we are most desperate to hide from them. She tilted her head, her wide eyes searching mine in that honest amber light, and I knew somehow, before she even opened her mouth, that she was about to ask me something I would not be able to answer with my usual easy lie. The room had gone very still, the way a room does right before something true is said out loud. I took her small hand in both of mine and held it gently against the floral bedsheet, the one her grandmother had sewn before she got too sick to sew anymore. My hands looked so weathered next to hers, so cracked and worn from work and worry and time, while hers were soft and unmarked and full of every possibility I was trying so hard to protect. The lamp spilled cream and gold light across the bed, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. I just looked at our hands together the way her tiny fingers disappeared inside mine, and I thought about how when she was a newborn her entire fist could wrap around just one of my fingers, how I used to sit in the dark of the nursery at 3 a.m, exhausted past the point of words, holding that little hand and promising her things I wasn't sure I could deliver. I'll always be here. I had whispered to her then, I'll never let you feel alone. I'll be enough for both of us. Those promises felt so heavy now, sitting here on the edge of her bed, 2 years after her mother packed a single suitcase and drove away in the rain without ever quite explaining why. I had spent every day since trying to make those promises true, and most days I thought I was failing at all of them at once. But holding her hand like this, in the quiet, I let myself feel the smallness of it, the trust of it. She didn't pull away. She just let me hold her, the way she always had, as if my hands were the safest place in the entire world. And maybe to her they were. That thought broke something open in me and held me together at the same time. I rubbed my thumb slowly across her knuckles, way I used to when she was scared of thunder, when she'd crawl into my bed and burrow against my chest and ask me to make the storm stop. I couldn't make the storm stop then, and I couldn't make this one stop now, but I could be steady. I could be the warm hand in the dark. I cleared my throat softly and asked her if she was getting sleepy, hoping to turn the moment back toward the familiar shape of bedtime, the routine that protected us both. She shook her head, just slightly, her damp hair brushing against the pillow. "Daddy," she said, in that small, clear voice that always undid me. And then she stopped, like she was choosing her words, very carefully, like she had been saving up something she wanted to say for a long time and was afraid of getting it wrong. I waited. The lamp hummed faintly. Pud. Somewhere outside a car, passed by its headlights, sweeping briefly across the ceiling before the room went golden and still again. I felt the bed dip slightly as she shifted closer to me, and her fingers tightened around mine, and I understood that whatever she was about to say, she meant it with her whole heart. I have learned in these years of raising her alone that the most important conversations almost never happen at the kitchen table or in the car or at the times you plan for them. They happen here, at the edge of sleep, in the soft surrender of nighttime, when the day's armor has finally come off and there is nothing left between a parent and a child but the simple, terrifying truth. So I held her hand and I waited, and I tried to keep my breathing slow and even, the way you do when you sense that something gentle and enormous is coming, and you want, more than anything, to be ready for it, even though you know in your bones that you never really can be. She sat up fully then, her tangled hair falling across one eye, and she pushed it away with the back of her hand the way she always did, an impatient little gesture, so much like her mother's, that it sent a quiet ache through my chest. The honey-toned lamplight caught the side of her face, and her eyes were so wide, so searching, looking up at me with a directness that children have not yet learned to soften. "Daddy," she said again, and this time the rest of the words came out all in a rush, the way they do when you've been holding them in for too long. "Why do you always say you're fine when you're not?" The question hung in the warm air between us, and I felt it land somewhere deep, somewhere I had been keeping carefully sealed. For a moment, I genuinely could not breathe. I had been so careful. I had cried only in the shower with the water running loud. I had paid the bills after she was asleep, spreading them across the kitchen table and putting them away before morning. I had kept my voice bright and my smile ready and my answers easy. I had done everything I knew how to do to keep her childhood from being colored by my struggle, to let her believe that the world was a safe and certain place even when it had stopped feeling that way to me. And yet here she was, 6 years old, with tangled hair, and sleep in her eyes, telling me that she had seen through all of it, that she had seen me. I opened my mouth to say something, the old reflex rising up, the easy reassurance, the "everything's okay. Sweetheart, Daddy's just tired," but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in my throat like they finally understood they had been lies. All along, she kept looking at me, waiting, patient in the way only children can be when they have asked something that matters to them. I asked her, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, what made her think I wasn't fine, and she told me. She told me she had heard me on the phone late at night when I thought she was asleep, talking in that low, worried voice about money. She told me she had seen me sitting at the table with my head in my hands, not moving, just sitting there in the dark. She told me that sometimes when I read her stories, my eyes looked far away, like I was somewhere else, somewhere sad. She told me she had heard me crying once, in the bathroom with the water running, and that she had stood outside the door not knowing whether to knock. She said all of this simply, without accusation, just laying out the evidence of a love that had been paying very close attention. And with every word, I felt the careful structure I had built around her collapse gently, like sand. I had thought I was protecting her by hiding my pain. I had thought that being strong meant being invisible in my suffering, that a good father absorbed every hard thing, so his child never had to feel its edges. But she had felt the edges. Anyway, she had felt them precisely because I had hidden them, because a child who senses something is wrong, but is never told what feels the wrongness twice as deeply in the not knowing, in the silence. I realized in that moment that my silence had not spared her. It had only made her carry the weight alone, the same way I had been carrying it alone, the two of us in separate rooms of the same dark house, each pretending for the other's sake. And she, my brave little girl, had been the one to finally turn on the light and say the true thing out loud. I had to stand up. I couldn't sit there under the weight of her question and her honest eyes, so I rose from the bed and walked to the doorway. And I leaned against the frame, with one hand resting on the worn wood, my head bowed, the dark hallway stretching out behind me, and her room glowing soft and gold in front of me. I needed a moment to gather myself, to keep from coming apart entirely in front of her, because some old voice in me still insisted that falling apart was the one thing a father must never do. I stood there in the threshold, half in the light and half in the dark, and that felt exactly right because that was where I had been living for 2 years, half here, half somewhere else. Half present for her, half lost in the endless arithmetic of survival. I could hear her behind me, the rustle of the blankets, the small sound of her breathing, waiting for me to come back, waiting for an answer that I owed her, and had never given. And I thought about my own father, who had been a good man in his way, but who had never once in his life admitted to being anything other than fine. I thought about how I had learned from him that a man swallows things, that he carries his burdens out of sight, that the love a father gives is measured in the things he does without complaint and the worries he never lets anyone see. I had inherited that the way you inherit the shape of your hands or the sound of your laugh without choosing it, without questioning it. And I had passed it down to her without meaning to because she was watching me, the way I had watched him, learning that love means hiding, that strength means silence, that you say you're fine even when the whole world is falling down around you. Standing in that doorway, I understood that if I kept this up, if I kept telling her I was fine when I was not, I would be teaching her to do the same thing one day. I would be teaching her to stand alone in a dark hallway, with her head bowed, swallowing her pain, telling everyone she was fine while something inside her quietly broke. And I could not bear that. I could not bear the thought of her growing up to be as lonely in her struggles as I had made myself. Wah. I gripped the doorframe, and I breathed, slow and deep, the way I had learned to do in the months after her mother left, when panic would rise in me, at the most ordinary moments, in the grocery aisle, at a red light, in the middle of the night. In through the nose, hold, out through the mouth. The hallway behind me was so dark and so quiet, the rest of the house sleeping, just the two of us awake in this golden room with this enormous unspoken thing between us. I thought about all the ways I had tried to be enough, the lunches I packed with little notes inside, the bedtime stories, the way I had learned to braid her hair from a video on my phone, my clumsy fingers fumbling until I got it right, the birthday party. I had thrown her on a budget so tight it kept me up for nights. I had given her everything I had, but I had never given her the truth of how hard it was, and I was beginning to understand that the truth, gently told, might be the most loving gift of all, because she didn't need a father who was never tired or never scared or never sad. She needed a father who was real, who she could trust, who wouldn't make her doubt her own heart by telling her everything was fine when she could plainly see that it wasn't. I turned back toward the warm light of her room. I came back and sat down beside her on that narrow little bed, and this time I sat close, so close that our foreheads nearly touched when she leaned in toward me. The single lamp cast its warm amber circle around the two of us, and beyond that circle, the room dissolved into soft shadow, so that it felt like we were the only two people left in the world, sealed inside a small pool of light. I took both her hands in mine, and I looked at her, really looked at her, and I made a decision that frightened me more than almost anything I had done since her mother drove away. I decided to tell her the truth. "Sweetheart," I said, and my voice was unsteady, "you're right. I'm not always fine. And I'm sorry I said I was when I wasn't." She didn't look surprised. She just nodded, slowly, the way you nod when someone finally confirms something you already knew. I told her that being a daddy was the most wonderful thing in the whole world, and also sometimes the hardest, and that both of those things were true at the same time. I told her that I worried about money, because I did, and that grown-ups worry about that sometimes, but that it was my job to worry about it and not hers, and that no matter what happened, we would always have each other, and we would always be okay. I told her that I missed having someone to share the worrying with, that sometimes I felt lonely even when she was right there with me, and that the loneliness wasn't her fault, that it was just a sad feeling that visited me sometimes, the way storms visit even on sunny days. I told her that when she heard me crying in the bathroom, I had been crying because I was tired and overwhelmed, and that crying didn't mean I was broken or that something terrible was about to happen. It just meant I was a person, and people cry sometimes, even daddies, especially daddies, and that there was nothing wrong with it. Her forehead pressed against mine, warm and soft, and I could feel her breath against my face, and I realized that this was the closest I had felt to another human being in longer than I could remember. She listened to all of it, this small, serious girl, taking it in with a gravity that humbled me. And when I finished, she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "You don't have to be fine all the time, Daddy. You can be sad with me." The simplicity of it knocked the wind out of me. You can be sad with me. As if my sadness was not a burden to be hidden from her, but a thing we could hold together. The two of us in this little circle of lamplight, as if she had been waiting all this time not for me to be strong, but just for me to let her in. I had spent 2 years believing that protecting her meant carrying everything alone, and here she was, gently telling me that I had gotten it backward, that what she wanted was not a perfect father, but a true one, that she would rather share the weight than watch me stagger under it pretending it wasn't there. I pulled her into my arms then and held her, and she wrapped her small arms around my neck and held me back just as fiercely, and we stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, breathing together, two people who loved each other finally telling each other the truth. The lamp glowed steady in gold. The shadows held us. And something that had been clenched tight inside my chest for 2 long years began, very slowly, to loosen and let go. I felt the tears come before I could stop them, and for once I didn't try to stop them. They just spilled over, hot and silent. And I lifted one hand to wipe my eye, quickly, an old habit, the instinct to hide it. Lily looked away, not because she was uncomfortable, but because she somehow understood, with that uncanny wisdom of hers, that a person crying sometimes needs a small moment of privacy, even when they are not alone. She tipped her head back and looked up at the ceiling where the little glow-in-the-dark stars I had stuck up there when we first moved into this apartment were beginning to come to life, soft blue-white points of light scattered across the dark. We had put them up together, the two of us standing on the bed, her on my shoulders reaching as high as she could, both of us laughing as she pressed them into place in crooked constellations that didn't match any real sky. That had been one of our first nights here. After the move, after everything fell apart, when the apartment still smelled like fresh paint and emptiness, and I was terrified that I had no idea how to do any of this. Those stars had watched over her every night since. And now they watched over both of us as I sat there and finally let myself cry in front of my daughter, the tears running down into the stubble on my jaw, my breath catching in soft, uneven hitches that I no longer tried to control. It was the rawest, most unguarded I had let myself be in front of her, and I braced for her to be frightened by it, to pull away, to be hurt by the sight of her father undone. But she wasn't frightened at all. After a moment, she reached over without looking and found my hand in the dark and held it, her small fingers threading through mine. And she kept her eyes on the stars while she let me have my cry, anchoring me to the bed, to the room, to her. There is a kind of comfort that asks for nothing and offers everything, and that was what she gave me in that moment. The simple, steady pressure of her hand, her quiet presence beneath those glowing stars. I cried for the marriage that had ended. I cried for the exhaustion that lived in my bones. I cried for all the times I had stood in the shower, or the bathroom, or the dark kitchen, and swallowed it down alone. I cried for the man I had been trying so hard to be, the unbreakable one, and for the relief of finally setting that impossible man down. And underneath it all, threading through the grief, there was something almost like joy. Because I was not alone, because my daughter was holding my hand, because the thing I had been most afraid of, being seen in my weakness by the person I loved most, had turned out to be not a catastrophe but a homecoming. When the tears finally slowed, I wiped my face with the back of my hand and let out a long, shaky breath. And she turned to look at me again, and she gave me a small, wobbly smile. "Better?" she asked, the way I always asked her after she'd cried over a scraped knee or a bad dream. "Better," I told her, and I meant it. The stars glowed above us, our own crooked little galaxy, and I understood that some of the most sacred moments of fatherhood are not the triumphant ones, not the milestones or the perfect memories, but these, the quiet, broken open ones, where a child teaches her parent how to be human. Beneath a ceiling of plastic stars in a small, rented room at the edge of the night, she grew sleepy. After that, the way children do, the storm of feeling passing through them and leaving them soft and heavy-lidded. She lay down and turned her cheek into the pillow, her hair fanning across it, and she stretched one small arm out toward me, where I sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers reaching, asking without words for me to stay. The moonlight had crept in through the gap in the curtains and was falling across the blankets in a pale silver wash, mixing with the gold of the lamp, and her face, half buried in the pillow, looked so peaceful, so trusting, that I felt my heart break and mend all over again. I took her outstretched hand and held it, and I stayed exactly where I was, because there was nowhere in the world I would rather have been. I watched her eyelids grow heavier, watched the rhythm of her breathing slow and deepen, and I thought about how fast it all goes. People had told me that before she was born. The old aunts and the grandparents. Blink, and they're grown, they said. Treasure every moment. And I had nodded politely and not really understood, the way you don't understand a thing until you're standing inside it. But sitting there, in the silvered dark, holding her sleepy hand, I understood it completely. This small reaching hand would not always reach for me. There would come a day when she would not call out for me at bedtime, when she would close her own door and live her own life and carry her own quiet burdens. And I prayed, in that moment, a wordless, aching prayer, that when that day came, she would remember this night. That she would remember that her father had told her the truth, that he had cried in front of her, and not been ashamed, that he had let her hold his hand in the dark. I prayed that she would grow up knowing it was all right not to be fine, that strength was not the same as silence, that the people who loved you wanted the real you and not the brave performance. I prayed that she would never stand alone in a dark hallway swallowing her pain the way I had, because she would remember that sadness could be shared, that it was lighter when you let someone carry the other end. Her fingers twitched in mine as she drifted toward sleep, and I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, and in her half-dream, she squeezed back a tiny reflexive press that undid me all over again. I thought about her mother then, with something softer than the old bitterness. I hoped that wherever she was, she had found whatever it was she had been looking for when she drove away. I hoped that one day I could tell Lily about her mother, without my voice going hard. That I could give her the truth of that too, gently, in pieces. She could carry. There would be time for all of it. For now, there was just this, the moonlight and the lamplight, the small warm hand in mine, the slow tide of her breathing, pulling her down into sleep. I had thought for 2 years that my job was to be a wall between her and every hard thing in the world. But maybe my job was something different. Maybe it was to be a hand in the dark, a steady presence, someone who would tell her the truth and let her tell hers, who would teach her not how to never fall, but how to reach out when she did. She sighed in her sleep, a small, contented sound, her fingers loose now in mine, and I sat very still, so as not to wake her, memorizing the moment, the silver light, the warmth, the trust of it, the impossible privilege of being this child's father. I thought she had drifted off entirely, but as I shifted to ease my back, her eyes fluttered open again, and she asked, in a small, drowsy voice, if I would read her a story. Just one, she said. Please, Daddy. And even though it was late, even though I was bone-tired, even though every cell in my body ached for sleep, I said yes, because how could I say anything else? I reached for the worn book on her nightstand, the one we had read 100 times, the pages soft and dog-eared from 1,000 bedtimes, and I opened it to the beginning. The warm cream lamplight pooled over both of us as I began to read, my voice low and even, the familiar words rising in the quiet room. But my mind kept drifting, the way it always did, off into the worries that never fully let me go. The unopened envelope on the counter, the shift I had to cover tomorrow, the parent-teacher conference I had nearly forgotten. I felt my expression tighten, my brow furrowing, as I read words aloud while thinking about other things entirely, and I caught myself doing the very thing she had described earlier. Being there, but not there, my eyes on the page and my heart somewhere far away and sad. And then I noticed something. Lily wasn't looking at the pictures. She wasn't looking at the book at all. She was looking at me. She was watching my face the way she must have been watching it for months, studying my eyes, my mouth, the little furrow between my brows, reading me the way I was supposed to be reading the story to her. And I understood with a jolt that this was the whole thing. This was everything. My daughter had learned to read my face before she could read a single word on a page. She knew my moods better than she knew the alphabet. And in that moment, I made a choice. I stopped reading. I let the book fall closed in my lap, and I looked back at her, and I said, "You're not looking at the story." She shook her head against the pillow. "I like looking at you," she said. And I felt the worry drain right out of me. All of it, the envelope and the shift and the conference, all of it suddenly so small. Next to this, I set the book aside, entirely. "Tell you what," I said. "How about tonight? I don't read you a story. How about tonight I tell you a true one?" And her eyes brightened, sleepy as they were, because children always know the difference between the stories in books and the true ones their parents are afraid to tell. So I told her one. I told her about the day she was born, how scared I had been, how I had paced the hospital hallway, certain I would be a terrible father, and how the moment they placed her in my arms, every fear I had ever known simply dissolved, replaced by a love so enormous it frightened me in a different way. I told her how she had wrapped her whole hand around one of my fingers and held on, and how I had whispered to her that I would always be there. I told her that I had broken that promise a little, by hiding things from her, by pretending to be fine, but that I wanted to make it again, the right way this time. I would always be there, I told her, the real me, not the pretend, fine me. And she smiled, a slow, sleepy, radiant smile, and she said she liked the true story better than any book, and I knew. watching her face soften toward sleep at last, that I would tell her 1,000 more true stories in the years to come, and that this was the kind of father I wanted to be. When she finally fell asleep for real, her breathing deep and slow and even, I tucked the blankets up around her shoulders and kissed her forehead and turned the lamp down low. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. Not quite yet. I slid down to the floor and sat with my back against the side of her bed frame, my legs stretched out, my head tilted back against the mattress, and I closed my eyes. In the soft amber dark, I was so tired. But it was a different kind of tired. Now, an emptied out, cleaned out kind of tired. The way you feel after a long cry, or a hard run, or a truth finally told. The exhaustion was still there in my body, but the other thing, the heavy clenched thing I had been carrying behind my ribs for 2 years, had loosened its grip. I sat there listening to my daughter breathe, the small, steady rhythm of it, the most reassuring sound in the entire world, and I let myself simply be still for the first time in what felt like forever. I thought about how this night had begun, with her tiny hands on my face, and a question I had been so afraid to answer. Why do you always say you're fine when you're not? I had spent so long believing that the answer was duty, sacrifice, protection. But sitting on that floor in the dark, I understood that the real answer was fear. I had been afraid that if I told the truth, if I let her see my cracks, it would frighten her, hurt her, take something from her childhood. I had been afraid that needing help made me less of a father. I had been afraid most of all that I was failing her, and that admitting I wasn't fine would make that failure real. But the opposite had happened. The moment I told the truth, my daughter had moved closer, not further away. She had held my hand. She had given me permission to be human, and I felt, sitting there, a tenderness toward myself that I had not allowed in a very long time. I had been so hard on myself, demanding a kind of flawless strength that no person could sustain. But Lily didn't need flawless. She needed present. She needed honest. She needed a father who would still be standing in the morning, even if he was tired, even if he was scared, even if some days all he could do was hold her hand in the dark and tell her the truth. I made myself some quiet promises there on the floor. I promised I would ask for help when I needed it, that I would call my brother back, that I would let the neighbor bring over that casserole she kept offering. I promised I would stop crying, only in the shower, and start letting myself feel things in the light of day. And I promised above all that I would never again look into my daughter's searching eyes and tell her I was fine when I was not. Because she deserved the truth, and so did I, and the two of us were a family, and families are supposed to carry things together. I opened my eyes and looked up at the glow-in-the-dark stars, our crooked little galaxy, glowing faint and steady in the dark. I thought about how we had put them up on one of our first scared nights here, and how they had been there for every hard night since, and how they would be there for all the nights to come, the good ones and the hard ones both. And I felt for the first time, in a long time, something I had almost forgotten how to feel. I felt hope, quiet and small and real, but hope all the same. Before I left her room, she stirred and murmured my name, half asleep, and asked if I would lie down with her, just for a little while. So I climbed onto the narrow bed beside her, careful and slow, and we lay there side by side, the two of us staring up at the ceiling in its galaxy of plastic stars. The room was dim and warm, the lamp turned low, a half-drunk glass of water glinting faintly on the nightstand, and the silence between us was full. The comfortable, full silence of two people who have said the important things and no longer need to fill the quiet with words. Her shoulder was small and warm against my arm. I could feel her breathing, slow and content. Above us, the stars glowed their soft blue-white, and I traced our crooked constellations with my eyes, remembering the night we made them, and I thought about how a family is just that. Really, a few people stuck close together in the dark, making their own light where they can. After a while, she spoke, her voice thick with sleep. "Daddy," she whispered, "I'm glad you told me the truth." I turned my head to look at her, this small, fierce, loving person who had cracked me open and put me back together better than I had been before. "Me too, sweetheart," I whispered back. "Me too." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you fine now?" And I thought about how to answer, because I wanted to keep my new promise. I wanted to be honest. "I'm not fine yet," I told her, "but I'm going to be. And I'm not alone anymore because I have you." She seemed satisfied with that, the way children are when you give them the truth in a size they can hold. She nestled closer, her head finding the crook of my arm, and within minutes, she was asleep again. Deeply this time, her small body, soft and trusting against mine. I stayed there long after she slept, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the flutter of her eyelids as she dreamed, the way her hand had come to rest, open and relaxed, on my chest, right over my heart. And I thought about all the bedtimes that had brought us here, and all the bedtimes still to come, and how this one would always be, the one I remembered, the night my daughter asked me why I always said I was fine when I wasn't, and taught me how to stop. The world outside that little room was still hard. The money was still tight. The days were still long. The loneliness would still visit from time to time the way storms do. None of that had changed. But something inside me had something fundamental, the lonely, solitary way I had been carrying it all. I would not carry it alone anymore. I had a partner in this small, brave girl, not in the burdens of adulthood, which were mine to bear and hers to be protected from, but in the truth, in the closeness, in the simple promise that we would face our nights with our hearts open instead of guarded. The stars glowed above us in the dark. The water glass caught a thin line of moonlight. My daughter slept against my chest, her hand over my heart, and I lay there in the warm, full silence and let myself feel all of it, the grief and the gratitude, the exhaustion and the love, the whole, impossible, aching gift of being her father. And I knew, as sleep finally began to take me too, that I would stay. Not just tonight, but always. The dad who stayed. And the dad who, at last, stopped pretending he was fine, so that his daughter would never have to learn to pretend the same.